Hi, welcome back to the Busy Corner. This is lesson 41, and I'm going to show you how to do a 2x2 twill knitted rug with a weaving strip in it. So this is the one I'm working on, and it is being knit on 30-inch long, the plastic PVC pipe. That's the hot water pipe, so it's equivalent to a US 19 needle. And I'm doing 5 repeats of an 8-stitch pattern. But I've put on 42 stitches, so I have an extra stitch on each edge. And I am making it with a knitting strip that is only 3/4 inches wide because it's a stiff 100% polyester fabric. I was pleasantly surprised when I tore this. It was a tablecloth that I got at the thrift store for $2. But it ripped really nicely and gave me a nice fringed edge. And my weaving strip is 3 inches wide. Now, when you look at this pattern, as it's, on the rug, you're going to say, well, that doesn't look much like the actual pattern for it. If you go online and you put in 2x2 twill, you'll see something like this that you can print out. And what I did was I blew it up for our purposes today, and but it will look like this, and there's tons of them online. And what makes it a 2x2, you can see, is that the weft and the warp, it weaves over and under twice. Two warps, 2 warps, 2 warps, 2 warps. Then the pattern shifts 1, 2, 2, 2, 2. You can see that each time there's a shift in the pattern. Now as I knit this, I did it exactly as it was. So I didn't create any other kind of edge. You can if you want to get fancy about it. So the important thing to think about as you're doing this is that whether you get a pattern offline, you could try basket patterns, patterns for potholder looms, knitting patterns. You're going to start at the bottom because that's how you'll see, that's how it works out. For instance, when I started this is the first row, right? Way down here at the bottom, and you have to read the pattern the same way, the chart. Now, you're going to say to yourself, well, that chart doesn't look like it does in the knitting. Well, remember, this is being interpreted into fabric. And if you look at your jeans are a twill. And it looks like a series of diagonal lines. If you just looked at these dark lines, you would see that, in fact. So, the more different in size and texture, the more that diagonal line will be accentuated. If you were doing this as a basket, it would be more obviously the up and downs. You get the idea. So all of your knitting are basically your warps, and your weaving strips are your wefts. So we're going to begin by, and again, this is basically an 8-stitch repeat because you have 8 warps in the pattern. That's how often it, thought of to repeat. So, you could make any number of stitches across, but I repeated this pattern 5 times for my rug and added 1 stitch on the end. And it's 22 inches across. You want to pay attention, since it's a continuous weft again. You want to make sure that you're not pulling them too tight, and you need to check every row. I like mine a little bit loose. Not so much you want to catch a toe under, but so it doesn't draw the rug in. If you make your weft strips too tight, it'll pull that in. And the one advantage, by the way, to this pattern, I forgot to point this out in the last video, having that continuous weft through there, or even one that you fringe, will help limit that stretch side to side. I think it kind of makes a safer rug, frankly. It's still not as tight as a twined rug, but it will help keep it in shape. So, let's begin, and we're going to put on 10 stitches so we can do the whole repeat of the pattern here. And when you cast on with your crochet, let me do that again. When you cast on with your crochet cast on, you'll make your slip knot and use a crochet hook that's similar in size to your knitting pipe. These pipes are a little big for the strip that I made yesterday, but I think it'll be easier to see. So I went ahead and I'm still using the 1-inch strip. And again, it'll depend on the weight of the fabric. Some cottons are heavier than others. This is like a chambray, I guess you call it. not that good on fabric, but so it's a little heavier than a sheeting. So once you've got your slip knot on your crochet hook, and this will count as 1 stitch, then just put your working strip behind your rod and bring a loop through the loop that's on the hook. And now you have 2. And each time you're bringing a loop of yarn through the loop on the hook. And now you have 4, and there's 5. I'll box count. There's 3, 6, 7, 8, 9. We got to do one more. Okay. Now, you should have 9 on the rod. 3, 6, 9, and this is your 10th. Make sure that the knitting strip then is behind and between, basically, and then just slip this off your crochet hook, and might need to pull up a little bit so you have enough slack to get it over the end of your rod and pull it down. These shouldn't be too tight. You should be able to move them on your stationary rod. And I like to start, as I did here, with 1 knit row. That's your basically your foundation row, and your pattern will show up nicer and your ends will match better. So you'll just do what you've always done, and that's front stitch your first row, and until you have some weight on here, it's going to want to slip off the end of your pipe a little bit. There's no give to fabric, remember. So I ended up bungee cording the back of my rod stand. I don't know if you can see that bungee cord. That works any better than anything I've tried to keep it still when you're working on something heavy like a rug. You could also do this all as back stitches, but I think this is much easier to do as front stitches. Alright, so now you have your foundation row done. Well, what does that mean? It means that when I look at this and open it up, remember the inside of your stationary rod stand is the right side of the fabric. So when now I look at my pattern, and I've labeled my rows from bottom to top, A, B, C, D, A, B, C. You see it repeats every 4. So you can see that the weft, which is your weaving strip, is going to cross over 2 warps or 2 columns of knitting. Then it shifts over 1, shifts over another one, shifts over another one, and it begins again. So that's what creates a diagonal pattern. Each row shifts 1 warp. So, and I've labeled it left and right, and that's important. So now, if I opened it up, I would say, well, now I'm looking at the front side, so I know my pattern has to begin on the left. That's the easy thing about charting. It's very, when you follow a chart when you're knitting, because it's very intuitive. A lot of people prefer it over a pattern that's written out. So now I know I need to begin on the left-hand side of row A. And I'll write that on my notepad so I can keep track. And I know that I need to have my weaving strip show over those first 2. Now, I added 1 strip on, or 1 stitch on each edge. So first I'm going to knit 1 that's not part of the pattern. So there's my knit 1. Now, I want to put my weaving strip on, but if I do that, and if I just drape it over now, I don't really have a way of holding it, if you get my meaning, because it's got to, come over this. You can hold it to the side if you want, but the point is that, it's easier to tuck it in, and I'll show you in a minute. So now I know the weaving strip is going to show twice. So to start, I'm just going to go ahead and do my 2 stitches, or you could do 1, doesn't matter. You got to have a place to put your weaving strip. You'll see that. Alright, so now I've done my 2 that are going to get covered by the weaving strip, and now I'm just going to reach up here now, make sure that it's in the center, and the knitting strip is to the side, and I'm just going to now tuck it down in there and pull it through so that I have it tucked now between the first and second stitch. That's just going to hold it in place because you're going to sew that in later. And now I can do my next 2 stitches. Now, you see that the warp is showing on the next 2 stitches. So that means I want to have this weaving strip down, and I'm going to knit 1, and I'm going to knit 2, and the next 2 stitches the weaving strip shows. In order for that to happen, it has to be up as I make the 2 stitches. There's the first, here's the second, and the weaving strip comes down over those stitches, and that's going to show on the right side. And now the last 2 in row A are 2 warp stitches that show. So the weaving strip has to be down, basically behind the warps. And the last one is my extra edge stitch, so that is just a front stitch, and it does. Now you can open it up. Does that show, Joe? Mm-hmm. So if you were doing a long row, you need to open it up every row and take a look and make sure that they're not too loose and not too tight. I like to have a little poof in them, to tell you the truth. I think it looks better. And once you're sure that that looks fine, once you have more practice, you know, you'll see that better as you're bringing it back and forth. I'm sitting way off to the side, too. I can't really see the inside. So, now, I'm on the right side in this of my pipe stand, and I'm looking at the front when I have it open. And I know now that my next stitches are going to start here. This is where my tail of my knitting yarn is. So I know I need to start on the right of my pattern in row B. Now, you remember the first row we started on the left, but now I have to start on the right because I want the stitch that's going to sit right there. So first I make my edge stitch. Okay. Watch your knots. Sometimes they get caught up. Make sure that you have it snugged up out there. And that's my edge stitch. Now the first stitch of my warp, I want that to show, so I'll just leave my strip down and I make 1 stitch. The next part of the pattern is to have 2 stitches, 2 warps that are covered by the weft. So now I bring my weaving strip up and I make 2, knit 2, front stitch 2, let's keep it there. And now I can bring my weaving strip down and make my next 2 stitches. And these will show as the warp on the front side. The back side's the opposite, you see. And now I take my strip up and I make 2 more. Now if you look at row B, on the far left, I'm down to my last stitch. Well, that means that I have to make that so that the warp is going to show. I've already made my 2. This comes down. And I make 1. And then, of course, the last stitch is my edge stitch. Before you can move up to row C, open your rod stand and take a look. Now you can see I made these 2 loose. So I can make this adjustment right here. You see, I started at the end. I kind of pulled that down a little bit. And you could even go back here and tighten up that first one. And you should already start to see that diagonal. So now you're at row C, okay? You're going to do your next row. Whoops, I should have written A, B. Now you're going to do row C. You got to keep track, but you can also tell by looking. So now I'm going to start row C, and this time I want the stitches that are going to sit right there. Again, this is the front, so I want the stitches that are going to be right above row B, and I need to start on the left side of my pattern. So I begin as before. I knit my edge stitch, And the next thing that happens is I want to see 2 warps not covered by the weft. So I will just knit 2 and leave the warp strip hang, or the weft strip hang, or the weaving strip. Okay, now I've knit my 2, and now I take my weaving strip up into the back for the next 2 stitches. So you can see that in the body of the 2x2 twill, it doesn't change. It's 2, 2, 2 up, 2 down, 2 up, 2 down. It's the edge where the shift is noticeable, and that's where you have to pay attention. And it's hard to remember. If you do all the tabby weaves first and then you switch to this, you're going to get mixed up frequently. So there may be times I have to back up. If you realize you've made a mistake and you don't know where you're at, and you think, oh, sometimes it's hard to tell just by looking. Now here I can see my weaving strip is coming down, and I've knit 1, I've knit 2, and my weaving strip has to come up. Even if you're not sure where you're at in the pattern, if you're doing 2, 2, 2, 2, okay, so we're at the end of row C. And now this comes back down. Okay, that's the weaving strip showing, or the weft in this case, you could think of it, and it's covering my 2 stitches, and I do 1 more. That's just my edge stitch. And as we did with each row, I'm going to open that up, and I'm going to make sure whatever pipe you use, it's got to be long enough to accommodate kind of holding the stitches out. And I'm going to say, you know, that's a little loose. But remember, one of the reasons this is looking a little loose in this case is it's narrow, and the strip I'm using for knitting is a little narrower than I would like for this pipe. You see how loose it is? So if I were going to do something with this, it wouldn't make a good rug. It's not dense enough. You could use it for a pillow, but you'd still want to line it. So we have another row to do, and now we know we have to go up to row D. Whoops, again. Now I'm looking at it, and I know I need to start with these stitches on that are on top of this knitting. You see how we've worked from the bottom up, and I need the stitches that are going to sit right there, and that means I need to start on the right of the pattern this time. From time to time, you're going to have strings coming off. So now I'm up to row D. And just mark it on your pad, help keep track, or you can, if you had a sticky, you know, my paper isn't going to stay because I don't have a long sticky note. You could kind of keep track of your rows. I'm going to start row D, and again, I'm starting with my edge stitch. And these edge stitches have a way of kind of getting stuck. You can always push your stitch down a little bit, the old stitch, and then snug it up. I get a little sloppy sometimes with my edge stitches. Now, that's just your first edge stitch, and I see that the first thing that needs to happen is I want to see the weaving strip. So that means the weaving strip has to be up when I make this next stitch, which is the first stitch of the pattern. It's the second stitch of the row, but it's the first stitch of the pattern. So now I make my knit stitch, front stitch, and I pipe it, and I bring my weaving strip down, and the next 2 are 2 warps that show. So I will make my front stitches with the weaving strip down. Again, watch your knots if they don't get snagged up and leave you with a loose stitch. And now I just take the weaving strip up and do 2. And bring the weaving strip back down. I got a little turned around there. I like to make my solid color, the knitting strip, if I'm working with any prints, and the print to be the weaving strip. It's easier to keep that so the color is showing rather than the unprinted side. I'm coming up towards the end, and so I've worked from right to left, and I have one more stitch, and I see that that last stitch, even though I have 2 on here, I have one more stitch of the pattern, and that needs to be a stitch that's covered with the weaving strip, and that would certainly make sense. You can see my weaving strip's back here, I've knit 2, and the weaving strip needs to come up. So that's another check as you go along. You could just kind of look down. When in doubt, if it looks kind of confusing and you're not sure, just take 1 stitch out at a time. So you take that out, put your finger through that, okay, and put it back up here. Or if you've made a mistake, and take that stitch off and put your finger right into the old stitch, pull your knitting strip, repipe it, and you say, aha, that was, yeah, that's right, that's what I need to do, and then you restart. It's easier to pull it out one by one. It's a little trickier when you're using the, you know, that upholstery selvage, because it's really fuzzy. Be careful, go slow. Now you see how this stitch is a little loose? It's easier to tighten that when I'm making my next new stitch, and it'll stay better. The fabric has its own grip, which also gives it its own problems, because it makes it harder sometimes to knit. So now I'm back to this last stitch, and I know I want the weaving strip to show, so it must be up when I make this stitch. And again, see how that kind of loosened up my last stitch? As you're making these stitches, you're going to have a tendency to pull the last stitch a little loose. So just take this side now of the new stitch and pull. Now tighten it up on your pipe, and now bring your weaving strip down, and I make my last stitch, which is my edge stitch, and it's not part of the pattern. You can always write it out that way. You know, I just know that I did it. And again, as always, open it up and take a look, and it should look just like this. Now, if you see, that looked a little loose on that last row before I started this, you can pull that up. On a big rug, it's harder because you're going to have to go farther, but you know, it's not impossible. But you want to do it before you get too far along, because then otherwise you're going to have a mess. And that's your 4 rows, and then the whole pattern begins again with row A. And that's how you do 2x2 twill, knitting a rug with a weaving strip included as the twill pattern. Thanks for watching.